So over the last year or so, Simon and I have been working on this body of work related to data governance, mostly in the African continent. This idea actually started when we're doing a paper together on how climate change and AI could be implemented in Africa. And we came across this issue of data governance. And we found that the answer might actually lie in the intersection of two very different ideas, Ostrom's work on the commons, as well as the African philosophy of Ubuntu. So we look forward to sharing, how we see these integrating and also, setting forth these ideas practically in the real world. As Simon mentioned, we shared these ideas, we presented these ideas at the African Union last year at the African Society for International Law, and we're excited to continue refining and building on this body of work. So glad to be here.
Thank you so much, Marie. So today I'm going to talk about several things. I'm going to talk about the AI development in Africa. I'm also going to talk about the current data governance regime both internationally and also, again, in Africa, how it looks like right now. And then I'm going to talk a little bit more about how we believe the Ostrom's idea, as well as the philosophy of Ubuntu, can actually facilitate the development of artificial intelligence right now in the African continent. So there has been a lot of conversations right now within the continent about how AI can advance development in various areas. And as Marie mentioned, we started with the goal of to think about the environmental impact and how it can help the environmental development. But when we were looking into that, it actually occurred to us that the discussion is actually way broader than we anticipated. So that includes agricultural conservation, but also in education and also in infrastructural development, that there is a drive of this development over there. So, but there's a lot of issues that they're encountering right now, and with the need of the infrastructure development, there's also kind of represents the lack of infrastructure there. And especially when it comes to artificial intelligence, you need good data that to be fed into the system. And the issue is that there's a dearth of reliable and high quality data in Africa, and also presenting a very significant challenge there, that it's stopping them from developing this industry. There's also the issue of foreign force, and that includes both the United States and the mainland China. When they're investing a lot of infrastructure, there's a lot of external sort of strategic consideration within that. So again, the continent, people in the continent, they have to evaluate all the possibilities and to see which government they're going to work with. So there's a lot of issues going on. But what we see here, the most significant issue that is happening right now is that, considering that artificial intelligence is an inherently data-driven technology, we can see the phenomenon of party outside of the continent actually have a lot of control over the African data, which means that a lot of data is actually not stored within the continent, but stored overseas. And that is rooted in the philosophy of privacy as a way to govern data, that we will talk a lot more later. But the idea that Africans actually do not really understand the concept of privacy, but if you have a privacy-centered regime, the idea is that you freely give away your data, and then that's that's the root of the issue that we're seeing right now. So the solution that we were thinking about, or at least we're proposing here, comes in 3 points. The first point is that the framing of data commons touches on the governance of commons, which actually holds significance of Africa. And I'll explain that a lot more later. But the idea of commons itself, this term of art, how that can actually influence how people govern their data. The second is the context of data policy. And again, right now, the dominant philosophy there is to think about data through the lens of privacy. But what if we thought about data through the lens of Ubuntu? How would that look like? How would a data governance regime look like through a very different philosophical lens? And then the third point is where Eleanor Ostrom's work that talks about commons governance through the 8 design principles. Again, how can that reflect within the governance of data in the African context? So I'm going to first talk a little bit about artificial intelligence. I'm sure a lot of you actually know way more than I do. But the fundamental idea of an artificial intelligence, although there's no unified definition, but the goal is to mimic or automate, replicate intelligent human behavior. So it's this process of replication of intelligent behavior. So that's the bigger concept there. Within that area, machine learning is a very, very important way to achieve that goal. So what machine learning does is they analyze data, they train data, and then they find patterns. And that's actually how humans think, which is to draw patterns. So a lot of the technology that you see right now that claim that they are using artificial intelligence is actually a subfield of machine learning, and that might include deep learning, generative adversarial network, or natural language processing. And so the main point, I think the main takeaway here of understanding artificial intelligence is that data is very important. That is pivotal to a successful machine learning model. And you need to have high quality, diverse, and representative data for accurate predictions to use across different applications. So right now, so given that data is so important, let's look into what are the frameworks that govern data right now. So right now, most frameworks comes with the idea of privacy. So privacy itself does not have a unified definition, but what we generally, or at least what the European approach generally agree on, is the idea of control over something. So right now, privacy, this is what we call the privacy as control approach. So the basic mechanism is that you have control over your personal information, and then I use consent as a mechanism to exercise, or at least one of the conditions of that right, which is that if I consent my personal information, then it's then you can use that information. And that sounds great, and the GDPR is based on that model. Right, so the GDPR is based on that model, and they have 8 different rights of your personal data rights. You can think about it. In addition to that, there are a lot of contractual or semi-contractual agreements that govern personal information, and that includes terms and conditions, privacy policies, data processing agreements. Again, these might not necessarily be a contract, but these are agreements that you can see in addition, or sort of part of the GDPR regulation there. So right now in Africa, there are only 25 of the 36 countries with data protection legislation. And that provides with some form of protection against automated data processing, minimal. And of those countries, only 3 actually provide direct partial protections against automated processing, and that includes Botswana, Madagascar, and Uganda. And 8 countries have no protection at all with regards to the automated processing. And as you can see, AI is right now a growing concern within the Pan-African policy agenda. And that has been a conversation in a lot of different initiatives, and that includes the Malabo Convention, the African Union Working Group on AI, the Artificial Intelligence Blueprint, and the African Commission Resolution. So, the result is Africans are more predisposed to give away their data without adequate examination of their rights. Again, there isn't enough regulation, and even within the regulation, a lot of them follow the GDPR approach to think about privacy or data protection as personal control. So given AI relies on data to effectively function, there's a lack of quality data across the sectors in Africa, and it's also a stumbling block to effective implementation. And so as you can see, there's still a lot of room for improvement within the data policy in Africa. And I wanted to highlight the issue of data localization. A lot of them mandate companies, foreign companies, to set up data centers within their country. And the idea is that you can, again, maintain more control over the data. But the issue is most of the countries that mandate data localizations are authoritarian governments. And the result is they would actually have more access to that personal information. And that's sort of the flip side of that policy.
And I'm curious, is that image of the orb? You know what the orb is?
The orb?
No, there actually is a sphere that looks like that, and there's an organization that.
It's Sam Altman's organization.
Yeah, that you look into the orb and
It identifies
it
you.
identifies you, and then you have some.
That's probably an orb.
It
That's
looks like an orb. Yeah.
In there an orb in the British jewels?
I don't think so, but
Yeah.
because that's the concern about it is privacy, basically.
Right, yeah, Marie actually she put that, I think, picture to resonate with that idea.
Mhm.
Yeah, so, it's from Nairobi. They came to Nairobi.
They did, okay.
The orb people. Okay.
Yeah. They're no
Interesting.
longer here. They were told to leave, yes.
Okay.
We can talk about it later.
Yeah, I'm just curious.
Okay, so right now, the central theme here, right, is that given that we need is that right now it's mostly about your control over your personal information. There has been a lot of discussion when it comes to think about data through the data sharing sort of lens instead of your personal relationship with your data. And there has been a lot of proposals to think about it. And that includes the personal information management system, data trust, data collaborative, data commons. I think we used to have a data trust salon here. So these are all sort of on the same, very similar theme that thinks about data in a collective way rather than an individualistic way. The main differences within these proposals actually lies in the associated legal mechanism or technical feature. Again, these share very similar ways to think about data collectively that is different from how we currently think about data. And they usually associate with an existing legal regime. So for instance, for data trust, they utilize the idea of a legal trust and to think about our relation using the framework of a legal trust to think about collectively the data pooled in the same resource can call a trust property. For instance, data dividend. There's also data marketplace that again you can trade your data in that way. So right now, given like all of these information, what is the solution? So the first solution is to think about a different philosophical lens. And rather than privacy, we thought about looking into what is the dominant or main or something that can represent a lot of Africans' belief. And that's where we started to look into the concept of Ubuntu. So I do want to stress that Ubuntu is not the exact or the only philosophy within Africa. And there's also a lot of different definitions when it comes to Ubuntu. And Marie can talk about that maybe later, a lot more about what Ubuntu really means. But the basic idea is it's inherent in a number of sub-Saharan countries and related Bantu subgroups. And it's captured in the Zulu wisdom and loosely translates to I am because we all are. It is the fundamental understanding that humanity is interconnected and to be human is to recognize the humanity of others. So for the purpose of our arguments, we think about this as to frame a very different value system that which we can access practical frameworks for the development of an African data commons. So now we know the alternative philosophy that we can approach here. The other thing is the framing itself. So again, let's think about data sharing as a way, or data collectively as a way to govern data. And so which are the frameworks that we should look into? So there are a lot of different frameworks out there, as I just mentioned. And we chose the term commons because commons are technically natural resources or common resources that are used by multiple individuals or groups and they can include land, water, forest, fisheries, and grazing areas. And this is a practice that is inherent within the African society, that it's easier for them to imagine that if I want to govern data, I'm going to utilize a practice that I've already been using for some time, for a long time, and use that mindset or the same mechanism, the same practice to govern data. So, so the goal here is to reimagine our notion of our relationship with personal information and the economic nature of data. So right now I'm gonna talk a little bit about Ostrom's work, which I think, again, a lot of you may know a lot more than I do. But Ostrom proposed, she has two main contributions. One is to pioneer the new category of goods known as common pool resource, and that is based on the subtractability and exclusivity. And that's a new category that is different from public good and also different from private good. So there are like 4 boxes that I will present later. And the second thing is, once you know there's that set of category of goods, they often encounter tragedy of the commons. So Ostrom at least observed is that you want to present the tragedy of the commons. There are 8 things that you should commonly do, or at least it's reflected in most situations where the tragedy of the commons do not occur. And that's where she won the Nobel Prize. So these are the 4 boxes. So right now, within all of these information, let's think about data through the lens of econs, and using the idea of Ubuntu to foster the idea of sharing information and thinking differently about our relationship with data collectively. So the first thing is that there has been a lot of discussion to think about data set as a public good. And that has to do with the low level of high difficulty of exclusion of donating and putting your data in a pool. So the question that we had is that should we treat data as a public good or a common pool resource? And that differs on the level of subtractability of that information. So what if we actually increases the subtractability rather than lowering it? So with the goal of machine learning development, again, machine learning needs a lot of information, so we need a pool of data to train the system, right? So a data set with low subtractability means that its usage by one entity or for one specific machine learning task does not diminish its value or usability for others. But a data set with high subtractability actually have controls on their access, usage rights, and sharing to safeguard data quality, privacy, and other interests of data owners. They cannot be simultaneously used by multiple parties without a decrease in quality or utility. So the goal here is to actually increase the subtractability and instead of decrease the subtractability of that collective information, and to think about it to introduce sort of a more private good aspect of this pool of information. So why should we do that? And we can do that because it can actually foster a more localized data ecosystem. The goal is to think about data collectively, but then making sure that whatever companies has that information is not gonna just share it around and to decrease people's maybe privacy, but to build up this localized market that would not make Africa encounter the issue of, again, foreign investment, the issue of privacy rights, and all of that. Right now, data centers operation in the continent are run by foreign service providers and headquartered overseas. And this can be seen as that a significant portion of Nigerian government agency, around 70% have opted to store their data on servers located outside of the country. And this is an example that you can have a lot of data that is stored overseas rather than within the continent. And this is due to a lot of factors and ability of data service and capacity of data volume stored, which influences other African firms and governments to maintain their data abroad. So in the same way, private investment from the continent can be deployed to build an open data ecosystem within Africa in partnership with the private sector and academic institution. And the protection of privacy, although it's not the dominant philosophy, but it's also still an important thing to consider. and this can be integrated within the 8 design principle. Yes.
Perhaps you have mentioned that, but perhaps I missed it. So if the data are stored outside of the country, does that also mean that everyone has access to it? I mean, it could be stored outside, but the access is still in the African country. So how is this related, the data storage and access? Because I think that's an important.
Right, so I think if data is stored overseas, of course, you can still have some sort of control over the information. But the I would say the other consideration here is how much so there are two questions. One, personal individual control over that information, and there's also the foreign government's control or access towards that information. And the goal here is to prevent the foreign government or control over that information. I can see there it is possible that that individual can have access to the same set of information, regardless whether it's stored in Africa or overseas. But I think the domestic storing it domestically still gives them a lot more rights that I can imagine. I can't think about it one right now, but the major concern is about the foreign government there.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so these are the 8 design principles that we wish to reflect on the governance regime that we're still working on right now. And these are actually the questions that we are leaving to discuss. We were thinking about what characteristics and Ubuntu approach to the governance of data as a common pool resource. So what does that really mean? What does it really reflect if we think about it through the lens of Ubuntu? And this requires a more nuanced understanding of the concept of Ubuntu. And just as we have a very nuanced, very multifaceted understanding of privacy, and that's how we develop different rights. So what about the Ubuntu? What are the associated rights? Or we don't need to use the term rights. We can have other terms to think about our relationship with information. We also are thinking about how can an Ubuntu approach to the governance of data as a common resource be applied across Ostrom's 8 design principles. We have Professor Angie Raymond with us, and they did a fantastic work on laying out how these two are reflected with each other. We also were thinking about within the value statement, we can think about Ubuntu as as part of the value statement in some ways to find a way to define the boundaries and such. What does an Ubuntu approach to the governance of data as a common resource matter for the development of data commons across the African continent and the world? This is to ask, why is it important for at least maybe thinking across the continent? What does that mean of a more localized data marketplace and to build up this localized conversation rather than something that comes right overseas and collectively within African different nations. And the final question is how to expand on the contextual nature of the associated data lifecycle and AI value chain and explain the unique concerns for Africa. So what is the thing that we really need, and what are the challenges that we're really facing right now in Africa besides the one that we just mentioned? So the key takeaways today, I hope, is that what we learned is that there's still a lot of improvement with regard to continent-wide consensus and harmonization of data protection legislation. Then there's also a potential to build a data policy based on the philosophy of Ubuntu rather than privacy, and that's worth considering. And the Ostrom's 8 design principles offer us a good starting point to build an African data commons. And the basis is to think about data as a common resource, and this would actually hopefully establish a healthy localized data ecosystem in the continent through contractual agreements. So yeah, that's about it for my presentation. I would love to have a conversation with you all.
Thank you so much. I want to invite folks in the room to get up, help yourself to some wonderful Robin made scones, some bagels. We have coffee and tea in the kitchen as well. And open it up for questions. Would you be open to putting it back to that slide, the like second to last slide? This one, yeah. Is that okay?
When you say contractual agreements, what are you talking?
Yeah, so one thing that we were working on is that, so remember we were talking about the current privacy data regime. Right now right now the way to govern data is mostly through the GDPR, like a regulation, but contract is an important way for people to give up their information. There are things called contract. There are things that are not exactly called contract, but they're like terms and condition, privacy policies. So one way that we thought about is that rather than there are two possibilities here. One is to create a new law that reflects Ubuntu and several design principles. But the issue with that is sometimes it's very hard to draw the line, and it would have a very drastic impact, again, from the national government. So we thought about more from the, besides public law, we thought about it from the private law perspective, which is contract, which is actually already being used and right now dominantly of how people give up their information.
So it so happens that Joyce and I, and a small group of other people are right at the end of developing a standard for exactly that. It's called IEEE P7012, and it's for machine readability for personal privacy terms. So if you were to look up, and it might be worth looking it up because I wrote about this, my name and then the most important standard now in development.
Wow.
It was a 2021 piece, but basically I focused on data because the GDPR focuses on data. Data is inherently problematic because it's like saying, these are my electrons, you know.
Yeah.
Michael Polanyi points out that life is actually a process of consumption and exhaustion, and we're just like a flame that's holding still, but stuff's coming and going. It's hard to say what's yours once it's exhausted into the world. But permissions for respecting boundaries are a different thing,
Right.
and that actually plays to a common pool of resources. So our understanding of privacy in the natural world is very tacit. We kind of, like, we're all wearing clothing. Clothing is a privacy technology. We don't pull each other's clothes open so we can plant a tracking beacon on people, but you can do that very easily in the digital world. So the idea behind 7012 is contracts between individuals and organizations where the individual proffers the terms rather than the regime that the GDPR comprehends, because they don't know anything else, is that we're always agreeing to somebody else's terms.
Yeah. Their
Their terms are always going to suck. Okay, so they should agree to our terms, but our terms can be friendly. They can say, go ahead and track me, but just not off your site, or use my data for these third-party purposes, but not more than that. And that actually does map to the GDPR. But the whole idea is that the contracts start with the individual. And an interesting thing about contracts is that they are laws that two parties make for themselves.
Right.
So anyway, that sums up 7 years of work. And this thing, we're right now ready to go to ballot with this standard.
And the goal to go up to standard?
The goal of the standard is to completely upset the system we have now, where we're always agreeing to somebody else's terms. And for example, data could be harvested from everybody without like with the orb, you know, we talked with those people a couple of years ago when they went to our conference, and there's no privacy in it at all. I mean, it's not respected at all. It's like, hey, you get to identify biometrically, basically, and then we get to do whatever we want with your data, roughly.
So let me just add something to this
Yeah.
that I think will clarify. So as you very clearly point out in this presentation, to go down the state level law routine is like a fool's errand. There would be a very long time. I mean, and Africa, interestingly enough, is a perfect way to study this because it's way earlier in its lawmaking. I mean, GDPR, you can think, well, it's solved in the EU, so we'll just do it that way. Well, it isn't solved in Africa, so that's really a cool thing. But that the only way that individuals can get into this game at all is to use contract law. And that is what I think is the nub of what you've got here. And that is exactly what we're relying on with this standard, is that I, as an individual, can say to any entity, this is what I will allow you to do with my data. We can't imagine, it's such a head switch to imagine that the individual would make the contract. Because since the 30s, when we've had contracts of adhesion, that it's always been the entity that tells you what the contract is. So this standard is a simple way where you as an individual, you don't have to like write the law. You can just click on an icon that says, okay, you can track me only on your site, not off your site. That kind of
There'll
thing.
be a limit, in the same way it's on the Creative Commons model, where here's a list of 10 laws, 10 contracts, pick one, right? And this one is most restrictive, this one is most liberal, but there could be an Ubuntu one.
Right.
I mean, let's say, I'm in Uganda, so the one that I have, that would be in, say, the Ugandan, location, or, it would say, like the Creative Commons, by the way, if you look at it, they have only like 6 different licenses, but they differ by country enormously. So, and there's a very long list of countries that have different licenses. So, there could be one for Uganda or Kenya or wherever that say, whatever data you collected about me is only useful in this, within these boundaries or on these data centers. It's wide open what they could say. The main point is that the mechanism of it is you choose from a menu, and actually you have an agent. It's probably a plugin in your browser.
Right.
That automatically knows these things. The difference between what we have now is that you keep a copy and the other party keeps a copy, and you both know what it is. And if you want to dispute it later, you can. And that also comports with one of Lynn Ostrom's principles that you can have dispute resolution.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's very, so I'm gonna look into that and to see how
That'd help.
Ubuntu can actually do some twists, but
Yeah, no, it's
follow the
really good.
very similar model on standards.
In our own, excuse me, go ahead.
Just Jamie had her hand up next.
Okay.
And then come to you.
He's on.
Jamie.
Good morning, everyone. Hi, how are you?
Hey, there's Jamie. The team's all here.
Yes. Yes, we are. Yeah, no, Simon, this is a really cool project. And I have a question and a comment actually. And one is, you mentioned that Nigerians host like 70% of their data somewhere else besides Africa. And I'm wondering, is that partly just because of the utility of things? Because I know like even because I know data centers, for instance, have to be places that are cold, for instance, to help, and I don't know all the reasons why, because I'm not a data expert by any means, but so, is that particularly the reason? Are there climate reasons for why the Africans have to host their data, like not in Africa, or are there other reasons for that? And 2, here's my comment, and I just want to caution you about using Ostrom's design principles to design, an African data protection regulation regime, because the design principles were never meant to design things. They're meant as diagnostic tools. And this is something that Dan Cole, that I've learned from Dan Cole. In fact, the design principles were called something else. I've forgotten what that term was, but they're actually not supposed to be used to design things. They're supposed to be used to help you analyze a case study. So, and we forget that because of the name design principles.
Yeah.
we think that they're for helping us make stuff, and that's not at all what it is for. So,
Right.
anyways.
Well, yeah, so for the first question, maybe Marie, if you have some insights about the climate and data center. Marie, we cannot hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
It's the practicality of it. You're right. As it stands right now, it's perhaps more cost effective, especially if you're, storing large amounts of data like the government would do it abroad, the reliability of service providers, and also the existence of service providers, even within certain geographies, and particularly in West Africa, where, they need a solution because they have a huge population, a very concentrated part of the continent. So it makes practical sense right now for them to do that. But there are other parts of the continent where private players are setting up their own data centers. And there is an early regulatory framework that is allowing this to happen. For example, here in Kenya, the Office of the DPO would certify somebody as a data controller, which would then give them the right to run their own servers within Kenyan jurisdictions and store data for, say, big banks, financial institutions, multilateral donors, hospitals, schools. In fact, I know somebody who is an entrepreneur within that space. So it's actually opened up a whole area of commercial business for local Kenyan entrepreneurs. So it is a possibility. Just because it might seem difficult doesn't mean there isn't a solution. It's already happening in other parts of the
Thank you so much. Sorry, Simon.
Oh, yeah. So for the second point, I see, I think one work that I've been trying to think about here, at least when I'm engaging in Ostrom's work, is to think about how it can be applied in the digital in the digital world. And that includes think about the internet as commons, data as commons, or even blockchain as commons. And I do recognize that there's a lot of times a sort of like a theoretical, it may not perfectly fit. So for instance, when it comes to the internet, I think about internet as commons more like a metaphorical sense. It's not really a common resource. There's a lot of reasons that it might not be, but if we think about it metaphorically speaking, it actually can foster some more solutions that we can borrow from Ostrom's work. And the same here. One thing is about, I think there are two questions. One is data a common resource? And the second is, what can we do with the 8 design principles? And I think for the second question, we can maybe get inspired by it and to think about ways to come up with solutions. But yeah, the term as art is important here, and to find a way to, I think, phrase it that more accurately describes Ostrom's contribution and how ours either perfectly fits or metaphorically or get inspired or loosely follows. I think a lot of her discoveries, I think, is our goal here. But I really appreciate that comment, and it gives me a lot more context I think through Ostrom's work.
Absolutely, we can brainstorm sometime about some applications that do make sense from Ostrom's work. Like, just because the design principles aren't really supposed to be applied, and maybe the way to use them is, like, say you mentioned Nigeria, and so use Nigeria as a case study, and then use the design principles to understand what's happening with data in Nigeria. That would be the way to use them, and then you could extract your principles or applications from the case study itself. But we can talk and brainstorm about that another time if you like.
Yeah, no, yeah, I'd love to. Thank you.
I also think that, like, when someone puts something out into the world, they have hopes for it, but that people can do with it whatever they want. And like, she may not have imagined them as like a way to design, but if people find that productive, then like, I say, go off, like, go off and enjoy. Okay, Robin?
Forgot what it is.
Oh, sorry.
I worked with our old IFRI program here. We were studying forests around the world. And the data collection is really important. So we didn't have I don't know if it was a contract, but we had a thing called an MOU, a memorandum of understanding. Where we collect the data about the forest in a similar fashion, and then we had rules for the exchange of that. So the exchange of data is good if both people have accurate data. So it's hard to, there's a rub in there when you trade. If you're trading really good stuff for stuff that may be mediocre, so it's hard to work that out, I think. Because data is what counts. I go with the old rule of GIGO.
What's that mean?
Garbage in, garbage out. You can have a most elaborate system of analytics and if you don't put in the original data that you're not gonna get anything good in the end. So it's like to somehow to be able to say it's accurate or useful is if you start trading it around or making it available or consent to use it, you're not sure what you're getting.
Right. No, yeah, I think, and another context here is that when it comes to, let's say large language model, a lot of them come from data scraping, right? And that's another way to gather data and actually useful data. But at the same time, the goal here is that we need high quality data. And I think through individual sort of more nuanced agreements, the goal is to achieve that you can get a better quality of data rather than through other formats. And it is sort of an ideal way to think about the information and our relationship with information. But yeah, that's a goal. We do need good quality data.
The internet is. Okay.
I'll add you to the list.
Okay, first of all, congrats for all of this job. Amazing. I have a clarification question and then a more in-depth question. First of all, if I understood correctly, there are two main frameworks that you are trying to analyze or use to analyze the data. There is the privacy thing that is based on the property of individualistic thinking, like these are my things and that's the way that I wanna give you access or not. And there is the Ubuntu thing that seems, if I understood correctly, and that's the clarification, that actually data is about everyone. It's not a privacy thing. It's actually totally the opposite. Therefore, encodes my question. It seems that there are two cultural ways of thinking the data. One thing that is very Eurocentric way of thinking, that is my thing, is individualistic, is I create the thing, therefore it's mine, and then create contracts, then create ways of sharing the information. Or the other, that is what I believe you are thinking with the Ubuntu, is there is something there as a whole that is greater than many people, and how we could subtract it. My question there is, if there are different kind of cultures there, do you believe that as a whole we are able to create something that different kind of cultures can agree on, or because we are raised in different ways of see the world from a cultural perspective, it should be changing between different nations, different cultures? What is your?
So no, that's a great question. This is actually the question I would love to have the conversation in this group specifically because of the cultural commons group. I do see there is a danger when you do not so I think there are there's one important thing, which is that the GDPR itself has a major influence around the world, and this is called the Brussels effect, and impacted a lot of people how to rethink about their relationship with information, and again through a privacy lens, and I think it does has its contribution of to think more critically about your personal information. But the danger is that given the mechanism of consent, you just give it out. And so when you have different cultures sort of interacting with each other, and one is a more dominant culture, the result is you get exploited. And one example would be when the Europeans went to the United States and they introduced a property system, something loosely like a property, saying that, okay, this is a land and this is my land. The Indians couldn't really understand what that meant. They would think it was like a joke. You know, what about the cloud? You own the cloud. It doesn't make any sense for the Native Americans to think about their relationship with the land. And the result is their land has been taken away aggressively. And then they lost all the land. And what I see here is something very similar to that, which is you introduce a fantastic idea of privacy, and I think property is also a good idea in a lot of ways. But you introduce this idea to a nation that has not yet developed enough infrastructure and sort of understanding of what that really means. And yeah, they just give away their information. And I think that the second thing is, but does that mean privacy is not important? No, I think privacy is important, but privacy can be addressed in a different way in alliance through the local sort of culture. And I think that this is how we want to emerge with these two with each other. So when we think about Ubuntu as a way to think about differently about your relationship with your collective data, we do try to put together the privacy consideration, maybe part of the contractual agreements, something that is built in, so that they don't have to consider that too much, or at least it doesn't have to be, it will be a different mechanism to protect people's privacy. And I think that might be a way for different cultures to have a dialogue with each other, to notice the importance of privacy, but also notice that people may not care about their privacy at the same time, but you still want to make sure that they can be protected of their privacy, private rights.
Okay.
Yeah, my questions relate to other topics, so perhaps we want to stick, because you said that's your interesting
No, please.
we can go on with that, so.
Directly.
But I also want to react what you mentioned, where we can compare with when the European came to the US and with introduced the property system. I think, from my understanding, is that the different tribes here in the US already had also their some informal rules. So it's not that they don't have any sense of what is their land or not. I mean, it was not something legally binding or a contract or whatever, but they also moved only in their areas. So.
Oh, yeah.
What others say, that's my understanding. I think that's important. That's not that there was nothing.
Right, I mean,
It was a little bit a different understanding. It was not a property right in itself, but they already also had their own areas because there were a lot of conflicts between them, so.
And I think it might, I don't know, but I think that could have been about a relationship to people and not a relationship to land. And I think there's also a difference of like a connection to a land and a feeling of like mutual obligation to a land and a sense of ownership in the way that like European property regimes are, you're American, but like European property regimes are about like ownership, excludability, exploitability. And that like there are lots of different ways of being attached to a particular space.
Yeah.
I can also think about maybe also like sovereignty. It's not sovereignty, but it might be something that is that like the group of people have a particular sense of them versus other people. What does it mean to be part of this land? What are the things that they can do? And but property has like a specific sort of sets of rights associated with it that has very different implications. But I can see the similarities there. But I think there's also like a nuance on what property rights can really do in the future, that there's a lot of opportunities that might not I'm not sure if it's, maybe you would know, but apparently reflected when the Indians are sort of giving up their
Sorry, that was only.
Yeah, why don't you go and then we'll go to.
Yeah. Oh, okay, so only I thought it was interesting, Jamie mentioned that the design principles are only lens for studying something. I never heard that, to be honest, so I really think that Ostrom studied these different kind of, for example, in the Swiss Alps. So I'm coming from Switzerland and I also worked at the Swiss Alps, and it's really fascinating for me to see, because I was part of this system, and I really can agree on these 8 design principles that they happen there and how this works there. So I think, and I see it also in different topics, that we really think about how to design something. So from my perspective, we can think about that. Okay, we look at the design principles and think about how can we design a system regarding the 8 design principles. That is more comment, but what I think is critical here is how can you monitor? I mean, monitoring and sanctioning is really important that the design principles are successful. And I can't imagine how you can monitor these data flowing around. I have no idea. That is something what comes to my mind, which could be difficult. Because that is the same where when we talk about climate change or something, who should monitor the emissions, which another country or whatever. So this is the same problem for me, like this global, So, and then very different questions. The question is, what I thought in the whole discussion also about artificial intelligence is that one of the problems is that we don't have enough data from some countries, for example, from African countries. That means there's that is one of the problems that the data came more from developed countries. So the whole system is replicating and so I'm interested in that, how this fits together, like, because from my perspective, from the artificial intelligence, what I have understood is that it would be better to have more data from these countries to feed into the system that
It is always better.
So
perhaps I didn't understand it could be that there's a misunderstanding also from my side.
In the interest of time, is it okay if we hear from Joyce too, and then you can respond to all of them?
I did two things. First of all, the talk about, colonization and all of that. So Monday was the space webinar or panel here, and it was like, okay, now we're gonna try to do this exact mess that we've created here. We're gonna try to do it in space, because that's what it looks like from just the conversation about it. It's like, hopefully there are some learnings, right?
Yeah.
Of course, there are no residents in space, but it's just all out, he gets what. But there are, certain places in space that are a lot better, like that's where you put your solar panels. And if you're not in that spot, you're in trouble. But anyway, that was just kind of a side comment. The main thing is I want, in addition to contract, the other thing that you said from this presentation, for me as a takeaway, is the local. And that is what's actually really cool about thinking about, I think, common pool resource is if you decide that we are the group, and so this group is gonna share our data for our purposes, that then you can use contract in that situation and solve local problems with that. And so I really think that that is, just like anything, you start with the little, one guy is the dry goods store, and then somebody else sets up next door to do something else. It's like you have to start small. What we're trying to do with any of these data things is, what is the, GDPR? What is the whole overrun? And it's just never gonna hit all the use cases. But to me, really good insight of the paper is that local exists in Africa. That's be a perfect place for these ideas to start, where you create your own governance and your own little spaces around data based on contract. That's my comment.
I'm not, when you're talking about using the data, I'm not sure what subtractable data is. You want to give me an example of that, or you just use it and it would just be there for someone else to use?
Yeah, so, okay, I think first on the monitor part, yes, it's gonna be hard to monitor, and we want to make sure that we need to find a way to balance how the government can help monitoring, or the local can monitor in some ways. So the idea is to seek some technological solutions ingrained in the contract, saying that, and as a model, maybe say that if you want to do business in this way, these are the requirements that you have to fit so that you can monitor. And this has to do with how to sort of put into some technological solutions into that. With AI in African, isn't it the fact that more data is better? And actually, Joyce actually answered that perfectly, which is right now, there are two ways, right? We can contribute a lot more data to OpenAI, which is located not in Africa, and to make sure that they can train a large language model that can, that inherently has the philosophy of Ubuntu, or we can have an open AI based in Africa, in one of the countries that really represents their own culture and their own ways of talking and thinking. And I think the localization part is what we're trying to achieve here. So yes, more data is better, but we want more data stored in local, or at least have this more data from the people locally, and then governed by the local people. And that's the goal here. With subtractability, the goal here, and this is also sort of something that we've been trying to do, which is to set up a contractual, within that agreement, it'll be very hard for you to, once you have a data set trained, it's going to be very difficult for you to share that data with someone else. And that will be a different approach from thinking about data as a public good.
But the data's been processed in some way from the original data set, or
Yeah, it's being processed, and so people can donate, and once you donate, you have a relationship with that data set. But whoever who doesn't have that relationship would not be able to use that data set, and also the data set would not be easily shared across
that
different.
was like our memorandum, when we did the forest studies, we had an agreement that we would collect data about the forest. And that research group would have a year to study their data, publish about it. And then for the next year, they would share the data with the other member research groups, and then they could collaborate. And then after a couple more years, they would give consent and make the data available, but they'd get a head start. The people who collect the data would get a head start. And then through the memorandum of agreement, they would exchange data and work on it. And then, so there was a timing of how soon it would be available to people.
Right. Model. That's the model that we're thinking about, but.
Yeah, I wanna do you have like a closing comment? We can keep the conversation going, of course, but I wanna be aware of time.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you for the conversation, and I'm so happy that I got to share my research with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon, thank you, Marie.
Thank you.
Thank
for
you everyone
having
for coming. Please take some scones and bagels to go. And in 2 weeks, we will be back, probably in the Ostrom room, and our own Jamie Carini will be presenting her work. So,
Yes.
thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you in Zoom land.
We'll be
Thanks,
here.
everyone.
Where are you going?
Going to California for our identity conference.
Oh.
Digital identity conference.
You have to show up for that, or you can't just mail it in.
Hardly. We've
Property.
been doing it since 2005, twice a year.
You know.
Like 300 people from all over the world.
The same as 100 people, same group.
Yeah, our group, yeah.